Let's begin with Chapter 1 of Memoirs of a Mage. My name is Alissa Henson, and I am a sorceress. I introduce myself out of common courtesy, but the truth is, I don't intend on anyone other than myself reading these words. But if you are not me, and indeed reading this, then I should probably state why it's being written here in the first place. It all started with something my aunt, Aurora Henson, once told me. At some point in your life, you will reflect upon your journey thus far and be compelled to recall your past. For those of our longevity, this sentiment is somewhat inevitable and certain to arise more than once. So, I bequeath this advice unto you. Take notes along the way, as many as you can. Lo and behold, it appears my dear aunt was correct. Or perhaps the mere suggestion of such things was indeed some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, a seed planted long ago by someone far wiser than I. Would I have felt this nagging urge to recount my past had I not spent so many years dutifully documenting it? It would seem a waste, would it not? If so, I find myself thanking Auntie regardless, for I have found great comfort in the therapeutic process of self-reflection over the years. I still do. Of course, I don't have to recall, as I had written it down at the time, but I do indeed remember when she first spoke those words to me. We were sitting in a carriage ambling down a dreadfully bumpy and tediously long road to Thanet Island, where I was to become, just like my aunt, a sorceress of Aretuza. I find it hard to put in words the excitement that coursed through my veins during the journey, but if I had to choose one, I suppose electrifying would be adequate. You see, I had known I was to be a mage from, well, my earliest memory of life. Unlike most that find their way into the illustrious halls of Aretuza, and Barnard for that matter, I was destined for it. At least, that's what I was told by my aunt and her dear friend Agnes, who was another sort of aunt to me growing up, albeit much more distant. Knowing I was to be a sorceress meant I spent much of my youth eagerly anticipating the day I would become one. And being the impatient child that I was, I found the wait a tantalizing ordeal, on the cusp of torment. Much to my dismay, Aunt Aurora would often reassure me that there was absolutely zero chance of Aretuza admitting a toddler, no matter how much said toddler pleaded. Which, in hindsight, was fair enough. I spent much of my youth fantasizing about myself as a sorceress, in a pointy hat with illustrious flowing robes and wand extended in a striking pose, although, even as a child, I knew that's not what they look like in reality. I knew this because I had already spent a lot of time around mages, as Aurora would always bring me with her whenever she left Gorsvelen to visit her colleagues and acquaintances. I even met all founding members of the Chapter of the Gift and the Art before I could walk or talk, which, as I was constantly assured, was a rare privilege. In fact, that was the time when I had my first conduit event, as it's often referred to, when a child first displays an affinity for magic. I don't personally remember the details, but the story has been told to me so many times growing up. All these years later, I still find myself smiling gleefully at the thought of Herbert Stamelford flapping around in hysterics, frantically attempting to brush the horse dung off his cloak. Ghastly! Ghastly, he howled. So it goes. Although I still take offence at his claim that I had merely used my hands to throw the droppings at him, outright refusing to believe a child of my age, and a girl no less, was capable of such potent telekinetic ability. The last time I met him, he professed to have entirely forgotten the event and questioned if any of it had happened at all. I think he was still embarrassed. You would be, right? Anyway, the day we first travelled to Aretuza on that god's-awful wagon, I was 11 years of age, which, I'm still proud to flaunt, was relatively young for an adept. I still don't fully understand why we couldn't have just used the portal, although there was probably a lesson about patience in there somewhere, I suppose. Auntie did so enjoy her tutelage both in and out of the classroom. I had actually seen the school many times previous, from afar, yet had never been allowed to visit. Aunt Aurora had taken a firm stance on the matter, often responding to my pleas with an authoritative, yet calm, "When you're ready, child." Instead, I had to stay at her nearby residence in Gorsvelen while she taught, but thankfully I could at very least gaze longingly at school from across the bay. In hindsight, that was probably more of a curse than a blessing, as it did naught but further stoke the flames of my impatience. Now, all these years later, I find myself stricken by an overwhelming sense of nostalgia as I gaze at the words I wrote so long ago. The first words I ever wrote after Aurora's advice, in fact, scribbled upon a piece of spare parchment as our carriage pulled up outside Aretuza. I'm here! I'm finally here! This is the best moment of my life. I remember jumping from the carriage and standing in awe before the school, eyes wide, mouth agape. At that moment, I was sure, more sure than I'd been about anything in my life so far, that becoming a sorceress of Aretuza was the only thing I wanted in the whole world. It's funny how things change.